A little after midnight on March 1st, 2026, something hit the ground. The base was RAF Akrotiri on Cyprus, sovereign British territory.
The 1st, 2026, something hit the ground on a British military base in the Mediterranean. The base was RAF Akrotiri on the island of Cyprus. Sovereign British territory, not leased, not borrowed, actually British in the same legal sense that Yorkshire is British. A loitering munition, a small explosive drone, slammed into the base and detonated. More drones followed over the next 3 days. Greek F-16s scrambled to intercept 2 of them over Lebanese airspace before they ever reached the island. Cyprus's foreign minister stood in front of cameras and said the drone appeared to be an Iranian-designed Shahed, launched from Lebanese territory, almost certainly by Hezbollah acting on Iran's behalf. Here's what made that moment different from everything that came before it. Cyprus had not been attacked by a foreign power since 1986, when pro-Libyan militants hit the same base and injured 3 British dependents. Before that, you have to go back to the Turkish invasion of 1974. In other words, a piece of British, NATO-adjacent territory inside the European theater had just been struck for the first time in a generation, in a war that officially Britain was not fighting. The obvious question is whether this drags NATO into a shooting war with Iran. That's the wrong question. It always was. The real story isn't the drone. It's the 6 months that made that drone almost inevitable, and the quieter, less cinematic 6 since, in which Europe has been pulled from the sidelines of someone else's war into something that now looks uncomfortably like a front line, not because any European government voted for it, but because of decisions made about airfields, sanctions lists, and pipelines long before the first missile was fired. By the end of this video, I want you to understand 3 things that almost no single news segment connects. First, how a diplomatic breakthrough that was announced 2 days before the war began somehow didn't stop the war from starting. Second, why Europe's neutrality in this conflict was never really a choice it got to make, because of decisions about military basing made years, sometimes decades, earlier. And third, why the sanctions campaign now being waged against Iran is quietly turning European banks, ports, and shipping registries into targets in a conflict most European voters still think is happening somewhere else. This is not a story about who's right in the Middle East. It's a story about how a country can become a participant in a war without ever agreeing to fight in it. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters more than usual here. On February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack on Iran. Nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours. The target list included missile forces, air defenses, military infrastructure, and Iran's political leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening wave, along with a number of senior officials. Washington and Jerusalem framed the operation, later given the codename Epic Fury, as an effort to permanently cripple Iran's nuclear and missile programs and to open space for regime change inside the country. Iran responded the way Iran had long promised it would if pushed this far. It fired missiles and drones at American bases across the Gulf, at Israel, and at Arab states it judged to be complicit. And it moved to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas normally passes. Within days, shipping through the strait had slowed to a near standstill. This is the part that gets missed in most Western coverage. The strikes did not come out of nowhere, and they did not come in the absence of diplomacy. They came almost on top of it. 2 days before the bombs fell, on February the 26th, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, sat down in Geneva for a 3rd round of Omani-mediated nuclear talks, and made what regional diplomats described as the single largest concession Tehran had offered in the nearly 5-decade history of the Islamic Republic, a voluntary offer to dilute its stockpile of enriched uranium. Oman's foreign minister called it a breakthrough. A 4th round was scheduled for March the 2nd. The strikes began on February the 28th. Whatever you conclude about why that happened, and reporting since has suggested President Trump was frustrated with the pace and substance of the talks, following weeks in which a U.S. carrier buildup in the region had already signaled that patience was running out. The timing is not in serious dispute. Diplomacy was, by every available account, still technically alive when the war began. That single fact is the hinge the rest of this story turns on, because it means the war Europe is now entangled in wasn't the last resort after negotiation failed. It was a choice made while negotiation was still, at least nominally, in progress. And that distinction matters enormously for how European governments have had to explain their own involvement to their own publics ever since. To understand why Europe couldn't simply stay out of this, you have to go back 5 months earlier to a decision 3 European governments made almost entirely on their own. In the summer of 2025, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, was dying. It had been dying slowly since President Trump first withdrew the US from it back in 2018, but a specific deadline was now approaching. October the 18th, 2025, the date on which the UN mechanism allowing any party to snap back the old sanctions regime was set to expire for good. France, Germany, and the UK, known collectively as the E3, made the decision to pull the trigger before that door closed. On August the 28th, 2025, they formally notified the UN Security Council that Iran was in what they called significant non-performance of its nuclear commitments, citing uranium enrichment far beyond civilian levels and a loss of international monitoring access to Iranian nuclear sites. That notification started a 30-day clock. Russia and China tried to block it, arguing the E3 had no legal standing since it was Washington, not Tehran, that had walked away from the deal first. A Security Council vote to extend the deadline failed on September the 26th. On September the 27th, the old UN sanctions architecture against Iran was restored in full, for the first time since 2015. Here's why this is the historical parallel that actually predicts what came next, rather than just decorating the story with background. The E3's snapback wasn't just a paperwork exercise. It was Europe's fingerprints, formally and publicly, on the collapse of the last diplomatic off-ramp between Iran and the West. The EU followed within days by reinstating its own sanctions on Iran's central bank, its oil ministry, and its energy ministry. Iran's currency, already weak, went into freefall. By December, that economic collapse had triggered street protests. By January 2026, those protests were being met, according to multiple human rights monitors, with extremely high levels of violence. Violence the Trump administration publicly encouraged Iranians to continue defying. So when the war broke out on February the 28th, it wasn't landing on a stable regime blindsided by an unrelated ambush. It was landing on a government already reeling from a sanctions campaign that Europe had personally triggered 5 months earlier. Iran's leadership had every reason to view the E3, and by extension the EU, not as neutral observers of what came next, but as co-authors of the pressure campaign that preceded it. That's the piece of history that doesn't get repeated enough in coverage of the Iran war. Before it was a war Europe watched, it was a squeeze Europe helped apply. There's an older historical echo worth pulling in here too, one that several analysts covering this war have reached for independently. Some have started calling the closure of Hormuz 2026, and comparing it directly to the Suez Crisis of 1956, the moment Britain and France discovered in real time that they no longer had the unilateral power to control a strategic waterway without American backing, a discovery that effectively ended what remained of their colonial-era dominance in the region. The comparison isn't about the politics lining up neatly. It's about the pattern. A declining or overstretched hegemon draws in allied territory and an allied infrastructure to prop up a military campaign, and in doing so exposes the limits of that hegemon's actual control over the outcome. Whether 2026 marks a similar inflection point for American primacy in the Middle East is genuinely unresolved, but the historical instinct that a strategic choke point crisis reveals who really has leverage and who is just along for the ride has held up disturbingly well for 70 years. But here's where it gets interesting, because the deeper entanglement wasn't diplomatic. It was physical. Move the story from event and consequence to event, hidden system, and much larger consequence, and a different picture appears. The hidden system here is basing. For decades, the American military architecture in the Middle East has depended on a scaffolding of European real estate. British bases in Cyprus, an American-British joint facility on Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, refueling, and surveillance infrastructure quietly built into airfields across Romania, Italy, and elsewhere. None of that scaffolding was built with Iran specifically in mind when it was first constructed. Most of it predates the current crisis by years. But when Epic Fury launched, that scaffolding became the literal supply chain of the war. NATO's own Secretary General, Mark Rutte, later put a number on it that stunned even seasoned defense reporters. Somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 U.S. aircraft sorties flew out of European bases during roughly the first 6 weeks of the war alone. Romania authorized expanded American use of the Mihail Kogalnășeanu Air Base at Constanta, refueling aircraft, surveillance platforms, satellite communications equipment supporting a key U.S. missile defense site. With what one regional analyst described as notable enthusiasm from Bucharest, even as neighboring governments hesitated. The United Kingdom, after initially declining to let Washington use bases at Diego Garcia and on British soil, ultimately allowed operations to proceed through Cyprus as Iranian retaliation began threatening British interests directly. None of these governments held a public referendum on joining a war against Iran. Most of their populations would likely say, if asked, that their country isn't in this war at all. And formally, they'd be right. Not one European state has fired a weapon at an Iranian target. But Tehran doesn't draw the line at who pulled the trigger. Iranian officials stated explicitly early in the conflict that any territory used to stage attacks against Iran would be treated as a legitimate target. Full stop, regardless of whose flag flew over it. That single doctrinal choice is what turned Acrocotiri, Diego Garcia, and potentially Constant from rear echelon logistics hubs into frontline targets, without a single European parliament ever debating the question. There's a name for what's happening here, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in every base-hosting country from Bulgaria to the Gulf. Call it the landlord's war. You don't have to fight in a war to become a target in it. You just have to be the landlord. If your runway, your refueling depot, or your satellite relay station is what makes someone else's war machine function, the enemy doesn't particularly care whose government signed off on the lease. They care about the runway. Being a co-belligerent, in the eyes of the side on the receiving end, isn't defined by intent anymore. It's defined by infrastructure. That's the mechanism connecting a drone over Cyprus, an American tanker aircraft over Romania, and Iranian warnings aimed at a base in Bulgaria that most Europeans couldn't find on a map. It's not that these countries chose sides. It's that hosting has quietly become indistinguishable from siding, at least to the party being bombed. The evidence for how far this has already gone is not subtle once you line it up. Start with geography. NATO's own air command has publicly acknowledged that with Iran's longer-range land attack cruise missiles, roughly 2,000 kilometers of reach, portions of Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and Cyprus sit inside a theoretical Iranian strike ring. A missile fired from western Iran could, in principle, reach the Bulgarian port city of Varna. One launch from Iran's northwest has enough range to reach Romanian Constanta. It takes barely 200 kilometers to connect Iran's southwest to the Cypriot city of Larnaca. Civil defense drills have been running in Athens and Rome. Air raid sirens tested for the first time in years, specifically because these distances stopped being theoretical the moment Cyprus was struck. Then there's the economic evidence. Europe entered this war in a weaker position than it looked. Continental gas storage stood at roughly 46 billion cubic meters at the end of February 26, noticeably lower than the 60 BCM the region held a year earlier, and far below the 77 BCM of 2 years before that. So when the Strait of Hormuz effectively shut down and around 14 million barrels a day of global oil supply came off the market, European markets reacted immediately. Oil prices jumped roughly 8% and European gas benchmarks roughly 20% in a single trading session on March the 2nd. European stock markets fell hard the next day. Germany's DAX and Italy's main index down close to 4%, France's TAC down nearly 3%, Britain's FTSE down over 2.5%. By late March, Brent crude was trading above $115 a barrel. Analysts at the European Central Bank later calculated that by early June, European gas benchmark prices had climbed 53%. A jump that, remarkably, was still smaller than historical models would have predicted for a supply shock this size. largely because global oil markets happened to enter the crisis with a surplus cushion. The EU's own energy commissioner told reporters in mid-March that prices were not going to normalize quickly, war or no war, and repeated that warning again in April. Then there's the sanctions evidence, which is the newest and, for Europe, arguably the most exposed. In late August 2026, roughly 6 months into the war, the U.S. Treasury unveiled what Operation Economic Outcast, a fresh sanctions wave targeting some 60 companies, individuals, and vessels engaged in smuggling Iranian oil and laundering the proceeds. The jurisdictions named weren't limited to the usual suspects, like the UAE or Hong Kong. They explicitly included networks operating through Switzerland and other parts of Europe. Iran's foreign ministry called the campaign a declaration of economic war against every nation, not just Iran. China criticized the move as certain to inflame tensions further. Each of these, the missile range maps, the market shocks, the sanctions net, is a separate data point. But notice what they have in common. None of them required a single European government to declare war, join a coalition, or fire a shot. They arrived anyway. And behind all of it sits a humanitarian picture that rarely makes it into the market coverage. Iran's own statistical center has recorded inflation approaching 90%. Food prices have more than doubled since the middle of last year. Reporters inside Tehran describe households buying groceries on credit, insulin priced out of reach for ordinary families, and rolling power cuts spreading through the summer, with some villages rationed to just a few hours of running water a day. Independent projections put Iran's poverty rate climbing from roughly 41% this year toward nearly 46% by 2028, if current conditions hold. That collapse is precisely the kind of pressure that tends to produce refugee flows toward Europe's own southern and eastern borders, which is itself one of the quieter reasons European governments have stayed engaged in this crisis, even while publicly calling for de-escalation. It isn't only energy prices and sanctions lists pulling Europe in. It's the entirely predictable fear of what happens on Europe's doorstep if a nation of nearly 90 million people collapsing economically next door to the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now let me steelman the other side, because there's a genuinely strong case that Europe is still fundamentally a bystander here, not a belligerent. For one thing, Europe's actual military posture throughout this war has been almost entirely defensive. Analysts tracking the conflict describe European governments pushing back repeatedly against American requests to use European territory for offensive strike operations, not eagerly volunteering for them. Most European governments condemned Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf states while pointedly declining to take a formal side in the broader war, calling instead for de-escalation. Spain went further than most, publicly criticizing the initial U.S.-Israeli strikes altogether and calling for an immediate ceasefire, consistent with its earlier position on the war in Gaza. There's also a real case, backed by serious energy economists, that Europe is comparatively insulated from the worst of this. Unlike the 2022 energy shock triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe's gas supply wasn't in the same kind of immediate danger this time. Only around 8% of the EU's liquefied natural gas imports come from Qatar, the Gulf state most exposed to a Hormuz shutdown, a fraction of what countries like Japan, South Korea, India, and China depend on. Brussels-based economists at Bruegel argued explicitly that, this time, Europe was somewhat insulated compared to Asia. And diplomatically, several European governments have tried hard to position themselves as peacemakers rather than participants. Most visibly at an informal EU leaders summit held in Nicosia in April, convened specifically to discuss freedom of navigation through Hormuz, fuel price relief for households, and Europe's potential role in brokering de-escalation, not in prosecuting the war further. Taken together, that's a coherent picture, a continent trying genuinely to stay out. But there's a problem with that argument, and it's the same problem every time in this kind of conflict. Intent and exposure are not the same thing. Europe's defensive posture didn't stop a British sovereign base from being hit by an Iranian-linked drone. Its insulation from Qatari gas didn't stop European gas prices from spiking 20% in a single morning, or European equity markets from losing tens of billions in value within 72 hours. Its diplomatic hedging didn't stop Romania from opening a key air base to American operations, or the UK from eventually allowing Cyprus to be used despite its early refusals, decisions that, once made, Iran treated as fair game, regardless of how reluctantly they were reached. And the sanctions evidence exposes the sharpest edge of the steelman's weakness. You cannot simultaneously claim neutrality and have Swiss-linked entities show up on a US sanctions list for allegedly helping move Iranian oil. Neutrality, in a war fought partly through financial plumbing rather than just missiles, requires opting out of global banking and shipping networks, something no European economy can actually do. The war doesn't need Europe's permission to reach its banks. It just needs Europe's banks to be connected to the global financial system, which they obviously are. There's a credibility trap sitting underneath all of this that regional analysts have flagged directly. Iran has, so far, calculated that actually striking European or NATO home territory, not an overseas base like Diego Garcia, but the mainland of a member state, would likely hand Washington exactly the unified European coalition it has failed on its own, by triggering NATO's Article 4 consultation mechanism and turning European hedging into open belligerency overnight. That calculation, Iran back. But a calculation is not a guarantee. And Tehran has explicitly kept the threat alive against bases in countries like Bulgaria specifically to preserve its own deterrent credibility. So the honest answer isn't Europe is at war, or Europe is a bystander. It's that Europe has been operating inside a gap between those two categories that the war itself is steadily closing. This brings us to the part almost nobody is connecting into a single story. Go back and lay the pieces next to each other, in order. The E3 triggers the snapback sanctions in August 2025, formally ending Europe's role as neutral broker of the Iran nuclear file. Iran's economy collapses under the reimposed sanctions regime, and by January 2026, Tehran is putting down mass protests with lethal force, further hollowing out its own legitimacy and its incentive to compromise at the negotiating table. Diplomacy nonetheless nearly succeeds anyway. Iraq's uranium dilution offer on February the 26th is the biggest concession in the regime's history. 2 days later, the US and Israel strike anyway, using a logistics network built substantially on European soil and European airspace. Iran, following its own stated doctrine, begins treating that hosting infrastructure as a legitimate target, hitting a British base within 72 hours of the war's opening strikes. 6 months later, the sanctions campaign against Iran's economy, the same tool Europe helped activate back in August 2025, starts sweeping up European financial and shipping networks as collateral damage in its own right. That is one continuous chain, not 5 unrelated news stories. And the unexpected consequence sitting at the end of it is this. Europe did not get dragged into this war primarily through choice, ideology, or alliance loyalty. It got dragged in through infrastructure, the runways it built decades ago, the sanctions regime it triggered on its own initiative, and the financial system it never had the option of disconnecting from. The central revelation is this. In 21st century great power conflict, the front line isn't drawn by declarations of war anymore. It's drawn by supply chains, air corridors, and sanctions lists, and those move a great deal faster, and a great deal more quietly, than parliamentary votes do. If that interpretation is correct, the implications go well beyond Cyprus, or Romania, or even this specific war. It suggests that for any state hosting American military infrastructure, which in Europe alone is most of NATO's eastern and southern flank, genuine strategic neutrality in an American-led war may no longer be structurally possible, regardless of what that state's own government wants. The evidence increasingly suggests that the choice being offered to countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and the UK isn't really join the war or don't. It's host the war and accept the exposure, or refuse to host it and accept the diplomatic and alliance cost of refusal. A choice with no genuinely neutral option inside it. That raises an uncomfortable question about NATO itself. The alliance was built around Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, in defense of members' home territory. But this war is being fought almost entirely through Article 5's blind spot, attacks on overseas bases, on allied logistics, support for operations outside NATO's own treaty area, on financial networks rather than borders. NATO's Secretary General has publicly acknowledged real frustration about how thinly some allies have supported the American-led effort, even while emphasizing alliance unity. That's not a prediction. It's a sign the alliance's own rulebook was never designed for a war fought this way. There's one more piece of the puzzle, and it expands this story from a regional one into a global one. Iran's response to being sanctioned into economic freefall hasn't just been protest and retaliation. It's been realignment. As Operation Economic Outcast tightened up in August 2026, Iran's central bank governor announced the country intends to join the BRIC Development Bank and pursue trade settlement in national currencies rather than dollars, deliberately building financial infrastructure designed to be immune to exactly the kind of sanctions net Europe helped construct back in 2025. China, meanwhile, has publicly criticized the latest U.S. sanctions push as needlessly inflammatory, while continuing, according to Treasury officials, to host parts of the very oil smuggling network the sanctions are targeting. Move the frame outward, and what looked like a European entanglement problem becomes a preview of a much larger one. If hosting infrastructure is enough to make a state a target, and if sanctions regimes sweep up financial nodes regardless of political intent, then the same dang pulling Romania and Cyprus toward this war's front line is available to pull in any state, anywhere, that hosts American power projection or touches the global financial system Washington still substantially controls. Europe isn't special case here. It's the first fully visible test case. So here are the 3 things I'd actually watch next, because each one will tell you which direction this goes. First, does Iran ever strike NATO home territory rather than an overseas base? Everything analyzed here, Cyprus, Diego Garcia, the threats against Bulgaria, has so far stayed inside a gray zone of overseas facilities and sovereign but detached territories. A strike on mainland Romanian or Bulgarian soil would be different in kind, not just degree. It would force an actual Article 4 consultation, and quite possibly a vote European governments have been avoiding having in public for 6 months. Watch whether Tehran continues to calibrate its retaliation to avoid that trigger, or whether battlefield pressure eventually overrides that calculation. Second, watch whether the Iran-Oman proposal to jointly clear mines and reopen a shipping channel through Hormuz actually holds. As of late August, the 2 countries had outlined a plan to demine and restore a functioning shipping corridor, even as experts openly questioned whether Iran has the technical capability or the trustworthiness to actually carry it out without international oversight. If that channel reopens, European energy prices have a real path back towards stability. If it collapses, or if Iran uses partial demining as leverage rather than a genuine olive branch, expect another price shock heading into winter, precisely when European gas demand peaks and storage margins are thinnest. Third, watch how far Operation Economic Outcast actually reaches into the European financial system and how Brussels responds if it does. So far, the entities named have been described in general terms: brokers, shadow fleet vessels, unnamed banks. If Washington starts sanctioning identifiable European banks or shipping registries by name, rather than describing networks that merely pass through European jurisdictions, that would be the clearest signal yet that the sanctions war and the shooting war have effectively merged into a single conflict, one where Brussels has far less control over its own exposure than it currently likes to admit. Here's my ask, and it's not the usual one. Go find 2 documents and put them side by side. Find NATO's own founding language on collective defense, the idea that an attack on one is an attack on all, confined to member territory. Then find NATO Secretary General Rutte's own acknowledgement of the 4,000 to 5,000 sorties that flew out of European bases during this war's opening weeks. Read them next to each other and ask yourself honestly, does an alliance built around a narrow definition of attack still make coherent sense in a war where the actual points of leverage are runways, satellite links, and sanctions lists that sit entirely outside that definition? I'm not going the answer. I think reasonable, well-informed people land in different places on this, and the honest position is that we're watching the alliance's own rulebook get stress-tested in real time, with no settled precedent to fall back on. Tell me in the comments which reading you find convincing, that Europe genuinely stayed a bystander here, or that bystander status stopped being available to it the moment the first American tanker aircraft Constanta. And if you want to keep tracking how this evolves rather than after the fact, because whichever way this goes, it's going to keep rewriting what not our war is actually allowed to mean for a country that hosts someone else's war machine. So let's recap. because the ending here isn't a clean one, and it shouldn't pretend to be. Europe entered this conflict believing it had a choice about whether to participate. 6 months of drone strikes on a British base, gas prices that spiked % in a morning, air bases in Romania quietly turned into refueling depots for a war fought 1,000 miles away, and a sanctions campaign that now reaches into Swiss-linked financial networks have made clear that the choice was narrower than anyone in Brussels wanted to admit. The central consequence isn't that Europe chose a side. It's that the war found a way to make the distinction between hosting and fighting almost meaningless, whether Europe consented to that or not. So the real question isn't whether Europe wanted this war. The real question is, where wars are fought as much through basing rights and sanctions architecture as through declarations and front lines, does any allied nation still have the ability to actually stay out of one?